We have about 20 minutes or so for questions. So if people can put their hands up and then we'll identify them, and please wait on the mic if you can as we move that around. Yes.
Well, I think James fluctuates so much in his philosophy. I think he flirts with a humanism, he flirts with panpsychism, he flirts with a theism that limits consciousness. I don't know that I'd say to what extent. I just think he's a little bit all over the place in his writings. It depends what part of him you want to pick up and run with.
Yes.
I'd like to thank you for that presentation, which I think is remarkable in bringing together basically all the main elements of James's thinking about everything. It's really fantastic. And I feel sort of hesitant to ask a question because it's a small little thing that I wondered about for some clarification perhaps on your part. And this has to do with when you talked about the I, or the non-empirical self. And you talk about feeling rather than knowing before the splitting into object and subject. And as I remember in the Principles, he says we may feel that I, but don't know it. And I think you were also saying, this is what I'd like to clarify, that the I in appropriating reality or in appropriating experience feels it rather than knows it. Is this what you were saying?
Yeah, two things. First of all, did you say non-empirical? Because the I is very empirical. It's the empirical in its total richness. But that I, its creativity, is the knower. And in trying to reflect on itself, it turns itself into an object. It conceptualizes it. And in conceptualizing, you always leave out a little bit of the overflow, be it the reality of nature or the reality of yourself. So that I that's felt and felt together with other things is, I would say, the full concrete reality, the full self in its overflow. And in getting hold of it, we always have to leave out something. You conceptualize it just like reality. You can conceptualize it in so many ways and get more and more precise. There's always that overflow. And the same with the conceptualization when you conceptualize yourself. When you try to look at this thick reality and conceptualize it, you can conceptualize yourself in all sorts of roles and having all sorts of character and on, but there's always that overflow that you can't quite break down and stop. Yeah.
Then when James says we don't really know that appropriator, that owner, until it's dead and gone in a beautiful passage, this is what you mean, that when it's alive, it is the whole of reality and of experience.
Right. As we get hold of it, it's passing. So by the time we reflect on it, we've gotten hold of what just was. But you can never capture that fountain of thick creativity that does the knowing. I know me, but as I know me, I'm already passing into my concrete reality is already changing a little bit.
Hold just. Thanks.
You're suggesting the notion of a thick self versus an anorexic self, or maybe a pathological self. Can you comment about the self within the mode of production?
In what?
Within the modes of production, for example, within the spirit of capitalism in the U.S.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your last part.
The self within the modes of production, which becomes ideological, and then in the United States, within the spirit of capitalism.
Well, I think that would very much be in the sense of I see myself not only as I reflect, I'm not an isolated individual. You know, I don't just reflect on me in a vacuum. And the community spirit, the direction of the community feeds into myself, and I in turn feed into the community. So as the community feeds into me, I absorb that milieu. But that concrete self and its creativity can also feed back into the community and work to change it. So, I mean, these dynamics can hold within just about any type of community. In other words, it's in general a two-way dynamic. My creativity operates within a community. In fact, as I was listening to the paper on Royce, I was thinking, this sounds like James, brought out, what's implicitly there in James, like Dewey and my Lord, so much like Mead, it's incredible. G.H. Mead. I mean, I think on the level of human existence, finite human existence, that Royce and James and Dewey and Mead, I can't distinguish between their views of the individual and community.
There first.
Richard Dawkins and E.O. Wilson express a kind of awe and reverence for the universe, maybe what they would call the whole of reality, and I think they probably speak for many evolutionary biologists, but they being avowed atheists. I wonder how you would think James would think about their comments in light of what you've said about his concept of overbelief, or maybe it's your concept.
I tell you what I think James would probably think about Dawkins is that, number one, he's not very tolerant of the other belief. James to me is wonderful because he stresses lived out commitment. You are a theist or you're not a theist. And you have to live out that commitment passionately because it's such a momentous position. But intellectually, reflectively, you have to recognize that there's no bell in you goes ding-a-ling to tell you you're the one that got the truth. And when all is said and done, it's not that you're more intelligent or have more facts. You just make sense of the world differently. And so what he stresses is lived out passionate commitment, but reflective tolerance, because nobody knows. So I think James would find Dawkins very intolerant. And secondly, I think he would find Dawkins much too reductionistic for him. I think that's precisely the kind of atheism that Dewey so much stresses when he says he wants to reject both theism and militant atheism. What's so important in James and Dewey, one a theist and one an atheist, is to celebrate the richness, the overflow that just cannot be reduced to the contents of science. The contents of science are great. They explain a lot, but they miss a lot. And I don't think James will like Dawkins at all. I don't think Dewey would like Dawkins.
I think you misinterpret this. He has a reductionist element to him, but there is much more that he expresses in a much granular.
Oh, I know, but it still has too much of a tinge of reductionism, I think for the pragmatist.
What about E.O. Wilson, who clearly is not a reductionist? Guilty.
What's that?
I thought E.O. Wilson in the introduction to
Steph, hand him the mic.
Evolutionary biology is based on integration. and one of the leaders in the field is E.O. Wilson. So to say that it's nice to be able to reduce when it's appropriate is not to say that you're a reductionist. It is to offer explanations at the lowest level that are comprehensible. That's the kind of reductionist maybe E.O. Wilson is, but the complexities he's dealing with are such that it wouldn't be like a Dawkins reduce it to the gene sort of person.
So I was just wondering, did you want to build bridges from those contemporary natural scientists to the kind of spirituality that could be plucked out of the pragmatists?
I haven't thought deeply about these. The one point I want to make that struck me was that you were making a point that you thought James would have a profound distinction between theism and atheism. And I am saying I don't see that when I think about what E.O. Wilson and some of what Richard Dawkins is saying. I see similarities there, and yet one is striving for theism, and the others are clearly not.
No, I don't.
Both have profound reverence for the world, for the universe.
I don't say he makes a sharp distinction between theism and atheism. I say he makes a sharp distinction between a focus on this richness of existence and a scientific explanation. And remember, I said I don't think there's any. I think that biological, evolutionary explanation is fine, but I don't think it really can totally get at what James is getting at.
Dawkins offers a tremendously rich explanation of the natural world. You really can't. I don't know how one could deny this.
He has a very rich explanation of the natural world. He also has a very adamant position against theism. Right. He's trying to disprove theism. To James, that would be so alien to James. For James, it's a passional nature. It's the way you see the world. It's the way you make sense of the world. And I think any view, that can lay out a position that says to people, read this and see if it doesn't make more sense to you, is a wonderful thing. But I think he would be very, very outraged at this adamancy that's going on right now, between the two camps. For him, that's the last thing. His tolerance is so important.
Hillary Putnam.
Well, we probably need to change the subject, but I will say that E.O. Wilson is the author of a book called Consilience, which, in my view, as a professional philosopher of science, confuses reduction and consilience from page 1 on. If that book isn't a plea for reductionism, then I just don't know what is. But that's, we can disagree on the reading of Wilson. I do want to say this, though. What is now called, certainly evolution is enormously important. Dawkins has written marvelous stuff on the evolution of wings, for example, and stuff that he really knows, the evolution of the eye, the evolution of the wing. But there is zero evidence, and Wilson's stuff on ants is marvelous, but there is zero evidence that complex behavior patterns, I'm talking about behavior patterns now, not, say, emotions or, say, connected with testosterone, etc., but real behavior patterns are carried on single genes or small groups of genes in the case of the human species, as Richard Lewontin and Ernst Mayr, when he was alive, and Gould constantly emphasized. Human sociobiology, renamed evolutionary psychology with no change in content, rests on an assumption for which there is zero empirical evidence.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to return to the question of panpsychism, the idea that everywhere in all of its spans and wavelengths, the universe is alive and conscious, as I understand James explained it. And there's some interesting evidence to show that James was knowledgeable about the Samkhya metaphysic in the Hindu darshanas, in which pure consciousness and lifeless inert matter are in a dynamic relationship with one another. And he wrote an article on person and personality in Johnson's Universal Cyclopedia, which lasted for about 5 years, right around the time he's conceptualizing pure experience. And of course, there's his relation to Benjamin Paul Blood and his last essay on a pluralistic mystic. And it's my contention, basically, that pure experience, which is his unfinished metaphysic, actually is a continuation of his discussion of panpsychism after Fechner in the Oxford Lectures.
Mm-hmm. Well, all I can say is what I said before, is I think James sort of goes a little bit all over the place in that. You can read him as very much flirting with humanism. You can read him as flirting with panpsychism, and you can read him with this consciousness that's, limited.
Consciousness goes through clear stages, and philosophers usually are not familiar with that because they haven't looked into his psychology.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
You began with the two framing questions about how we know the world and what does the world have to be like in order that we know it. I think you're right on. I mean, this is absolutely what's important to James. And you ended with the letter to Royce, where James notes the continuity of the mind with the thing that's known. But in the middle, you said that reality overflows the known in any given moment. And I think that's right for James. But you also said that reality overflows the knowable for James. And I'm not entirely sure how that follows.
Oh, when I say it overflows the knowable, I don't mean it's something beyond what we know. What I mean is no way of knowing it exhausts it. It overflows. As he says, if you want to really get to the heart of reality, you have to, it's attunement to it. Because as soon as you start breaking into it, you're leaving something out. It's in its rich overflow, concepts stop it. And you can't get hold of it all, that's all. So any part of it is knowable. But in knowing it in one way, you're leaving something out in another. Think of a painting. When you conceptualize it, you can conceptualize, different people can conceptualize it in different ways. And they can all be very accurate, but none of them is getting hold of the whole of that painting, which you just have to experience in its fullness. So it overflows, but it's not something beyond it.
Yes, sir.
It's disturbing in a way I've spoken to Dawkins about this, and I've asked him what he thinks about non-theistic religion. And he says it's not real religion and he doesn't want to deal with it. Unless you believe in God, you're not talking religion. Now this dismisses 1 billion Buddhists in some with a sleight of hand. And I think this sounds so parochial to me to equate the religious attitude with theism when they are two reasonably distinct ideas. The religious attitude does not require an immanent or creator God to treat the universe in a religious way. And can we get outside the boundaries of our culture ever so slightly when we talk over these things?
Well, Dewey's very clear that, and I think he says it the most explicitly, but I think it's there in all of the pragmatists, that religious is an adjective. It's a way of experiencing. It says nothing about what that experience is related to. As soon as you get to that, you're in an overbelief that takes you beyond experience. And what's very interesting is to read Dewey's A Common Faith and parts of James's Varieties of Religious Experience. and their characterization of the experience is so similar. But they have differing overbeliefs. And what's important is the religious attitude, and what overbelief you relate it to is a different question. And once you have different overbeliefs, you're in a realm beyond experience. And here again, James stresses the importance of lived out commitment. It's a momentous option. You see the world one way rather than the other way. It's the way it makes sense to you. But intellectually, reflectively, you have to recognize the other guy might be right. We don't have any bell that tells us we've got the truth.
We'll take maybe one or two more questions. I think there's one over here.
As I read the essays in Radical Empiricism, I come to the conclusion that experience is the reality for William James. Now, this is experience prior to the distinction between subject and object. And I'm wondering if that's the case, and I believe it is the case, how would Royce, by comparison and contrast, characterize reality?
Well, once you take finite experience and bring it to that absolute, I mean, this is where James and Royce are just totally different. But at the level of lived out experience, they are just so similar. And even with Royce's absolute, he's trying so hard to keep the many in the context of the one. But as I say, once you take it from the experience toward the absolute, they're very different. I think this is why James can both see them as so much alike and yet is so different.
Thank you. Okay. You had mentioned early on in your talk about James's ideas of numerous paths of inquiry, and we unify the world in various systematic ways, but that none is more primordial than another. And I take it was that strand of James that you used to answer this question, that you regard Dawkins as taking one strand of inquiry over another. And so I guess I have two levels of questions. One I had thought of during your talk, and one during the question and answer. One is, do you think Royce would also say that none is more primordial than another? And do you think James would say of Dawkins that he's being religious too, in privileging of one worldview and having a faith commitment?
No, I don't think he'd say Dawkins is being religious too. I think he'd say that Dawkins, back to it, is just too dogmatic. I think he would say that Dawkins is basically missing the richness of experience. He doesn't lay out an alternative way of saying, look, this is a meaningful alternative. Dewey does. See, there's two strands in Dewey. One is attacking theism, but he does that really because he objects to the absolutizing of ideals. But the other is saying, all right, this is another alternative. It's not that scientific atheism, and it's not theism. Let me lay it out for you. And Dawkins doesn't do anything like that. It's attack, attack, attack. And it's like he's going to convince, I don't know if he thinks he's offering proof or what, but James is right. There is no proof, but it's a lived out commitment. And what I'm saying is all the pragmatists opt for this religious dimension of human existence. They take different overbeliefs, but they all celebrate this religious dimension of human existence. And when I read Dawkins, I don't think he does. Well, it's just, I think it would be very upsetting to James. Except when they do present it, it's usually discussed in scientific terms. And here again, the biology's wonderful. You know, my gosh, all the pragmatism, they thrive on evolutionary theory. The whole notion of Deweyan connectedness is based on evolutionary theory. I wouldn't dream of denying evolutionary theory. But there's just this spiritual richness, fatness of existence that when you hit theism in terms of that, to me you've lost the Deweyan alternative. And it's a beautiful alternative. It's because it's an alternative within pragmatism, the very fiber of pragmatism.
Great. I think we need to wind up. Thank you very much. It's delightful.